Hello and welcome. How can Sudan avoid another explosion of violence 5 years after an agreement was signed to end Africa's longest-running civil war? The comprehensive peace agreement ended the 22-year war between the Arab-Muslim North and the non-Arab, non-Muslim South. It was a bitter conflict that killed more than 1.5 million people. The peace deal called for democratic governance, the sharing of oil revenues, and a timetable for a referendum on southern Sudan's independence. But all of that's in danger of unraveling with rising ethnic and tribal violence in the south. International aid groups say that last year, about 2,500 people were killed and 350,000 fled their homes, a human toll greater than in Darfur in the country's west. The report also says a lack of development aid in southern Sudan threatens the chances of maintaining peace there. Well, less than half of the population has access to clean water, and maternal mortality rates are among the worst in the world. As far as infrastructure, there is fewer than 50 kilometers of paved roads in the entire region, which covers an area the size of France. In addition, renewed violence has already erupted over voter registration as Sudan prepares for its first election in 24 years. Today we ask, is the international community again ignoring the warning signs in Sudan? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Joining me now is U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, Scott Graan, a retired Major General of the United States Air Force. He says engaging Omar al-Bashir's government is the only way to bring peace in that country. General, it's good to have you here, sir.
Thank you very much, Rez.
Sir, has that 5-year peace deal in Sudan really had any effect in changing the situation there, you feel?
It has. It's had a great effect, although much remains to be done. In terms of the positive things, we've seen that it did end 22 years of civil war. It did bring the weapons and the armies of the north out, and it did allow the government of Sudan in the south to be established. We've seen that oil has been shared, and recently we saw a passage of many laws that will help promote the democratic transformation that is embodied in the comprehensive peace agreement.
Well, General, of course, people wonder what the US's commitment is to Sudan. I wonder if you can clarify, in terms of keeping that peace deal intact, what is the US doing, especially in particular making sure civilians stay safe in the meantime?
Well, you're exactly right. The security issue is a big one, and that's where we're concentrating on. But I tell you, Riz, what we're trying to do is create an environment where the parties themselves, where the neighbors of Sudan can make a difference in the future of Sudan. So we're trying to create an environment where the parties can talk to each other in frank dialogue, where they can come up with an agreements that we can help implement. And certainly security is going to be foremost in our efforts in this next year.
Considering the tensions in the region, what gives you a sense that there could be genuine cohesion among those neighboring countries for Sudan's interests?
Well, it's to everybody's benefit to make sure that Sudan is a success, because the consequences of failure, the consequences of a civil war that could erupt, will be disastrous for the entire region. So we're working with leaders around the region and even around the world to ensure that the referenda are credible, that we plan far enough in advance to ensure that if the people of southern Sudan and Abyei vote to become a separate nation, that they'll have the best possible chance of becoming a successful nation.
In terms of what you say there, General, in terms of dealing with leaders and creating credibility, how does it sit with the, should peace be achieved at any cost, including even accepting a leader, President Omar al-Bashir, who's been indicted on charges of crimes against humanity?
Well, we believe that right now our mandate is to save lives. Our mandate is to implement the comprehensive peace agreement. And to do that, we have to talk to Khartoum, we have to talk to Juba, we have to talk to players around the area. What we also know that we cannot have a durable and lasting peace unless accountability and justice are factored in. And we believe that when the time is right, that will happen.
What mechanisms could you use to make sure that does take place? If Omar al-Bashir is accused of all these crimes against his people, what can you do to put pressure on him for change? Would sanctions work, for example?
Well, we have a regime of both pressures and incentives, and that's the centerpiece of our strategy. We're in the process now of reviewing the benchmarks. We're reviewing what has actually happened on the ground, and we'll compare the two. And where there's progress, then there should be incentives. And where there's stalemates or even backsliding, then we need to continue pressures in conjunction with our partners around the world.
How do you cope with the divisions that occur in the international community over issues of Sudan's leadership, in particular the indictment against the president, when you consider the Arab League, the African Union and so on? They're reluctant to accept this decision, yet there's pressure from the Western community to do something about President Bashir.
Well, we're looking at all the options that are available to us. As you know, President Mbeki and the African Union's high-level panel has put together some recommendations. We know the position of the ICC, and we're working through all these processes to ensure that justice is done in the end and that accountability is accomplished. We also want to make sure that the people of Darfur and the people of the South who have suffered have a legal way of getting their claims and their issues raised and resolved. Restitution, forgiveness, compensation, land reform, all these things must be part of the final solution.
General, we have a caller from Uganda on the line. Iaga, your question, please. Thanks for being with us.
My question is to the retired General Scott Graan. He has been engaging the National Congress Party and the SPLM, but we have seen the outcome of those engagements really slim. General Scott, are you confident that the National Congress Party is going to allow Southern Sudan to exercise fair and fair referendum?
Okay. Do you feel that did you hear that? Yeah.
Yes, I am. We've seen many things that give us hope that the referendum will take place on time. We've seen that in Abyei that both parties recognized the solution of The Hague, and we were able to have a peaceful transition and acceptance of the borders. We've seen that over 79% of the people registered to vote in the election. We've seen that the government has allowed this to continue. And we believe that as the democratic process continues, as the international community gets involved, and as the parties themselves see the benefit of allowing the people to express their will, that this will take place. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be hard. There's a lot of challenges associated with this. But in working with the parties themselves, in working with the regional leaders, in working with the international community, I believe we can achieve the outcome. I believe that the referendum can take place as planned on January of 2011.
What about the election in April, sir, with the current security situation, with the threat of violence increasing and so on? What real free and fair election could take place?
We're looking to make sure that the election is credible. And so, in addition to getting the laws passed, we're looking to try to get voter registration, the security, the administration logistics, the transparency. We're working with the European Union to bring down about 300 monitors if possible. The Carter Center has offered up monitors. So we're working very hard to make sure that the election can take place in a way that's credible. You have to recognize that the last election in Sudan was in 1986. So we've gone for about 24 years without a legacy of democratic process. It is also a situation where we've only been 5 years outside of a conflict. And so this is a tough situation, and I believe, though, that the democratic traditions are catching on, and people want to express their will, and we need to give them every opportunity to do just that.
If the South does split, is that the only solution in your opinion? And if it does split, is it able to sustain itself?
Well, the decision is theirs. The CPA made it possible for the South to choose unity or to choose to secede and become independent. If they decide to become independent, and it is after a credible referendum, then I think it's our responsibility to accept that in the world community and to help the South and to do what we need to do to help them with governance, to establishing the social and economic and security infrastructures so that they can be successful, because I will tell you, failure is not an option.
So how much has the issue of oil security been taken into consideration here, considering it's a bigger factor in for those considering the future of Sudan? All those who have a vested interest also have to look at the oil security issue.
Well, we all know that we need to have security and stability for oil to continue to be pumped. Right now, a large proportion of the southern Sudanese income comes from oil, and yet most of that oil infrastructure is in the north. So these are some of the things that we're working on right now, Riz. We've got to come to agreements on the post-2011 arrangements. We have to come to agreements now on citizenship, on the north-south border demarcation, on how we're going to do the oil, how we're going to do grazing rights, and how we're going to do the water. When I say we, It really is up to the government of Sudan and the government of Southern Sudan, but we are so invested in the process. We want them to succeed. That's why I use the word we, even though really it's up to them. It's Africans solving Africans' problems.
Well, Mozambique's on the line. Osman has a question for you, General. Osman, go ahead, please.
Assalamu alaikum, Rees.
Good
evening, sir. I have two questions for the gentleman. First question is, how many African countries are engaged on these negotiations with the Sudanese government? And second question is, can we know if in the past America was by any way involved in the dealing with arms with any part of conflict?
Okay. The first part was the engagement of African countries. How many are involved in the whole situation?
Right now, the Africa Union is involved through President Mbeki and the panel, and we certainly consult with all the leaders in the neighborhood. I just met Friday with Abu Ghait and General Suleiman from Egypt. I've been in constant communications with Chad and Libya, both of whom have been very helpful in trying to resolve the Darfur issues. I'm leaving on the 26th to go to Kenya and to Uganda to meet with President Museveni, and then I'll be at the AU conference. We cannot do this without the support of Africa. We cannot do this without their involvement in the issues.
And a quick thought on the second part there, the arms, involvement of the US in providing arms at any stage in this conflict.
Well, certainly we're not providing arms, and certainly we're not providing any lethal aid. And in fact, what we're trying to do is ensure that the flow of arms, munitions, and equipment stops, because there's already too many guns, too many weapons in both Southern Sudan and in Darfur. What we need to do is start talking about how do we mitigate conflict? How do we use peaceful means to resolve differences? Guns and violence are never a good option.
Quick thought briefly before I let you go, General. Is AFRICOM ever going to make it to Africa?
AFRICOM is involved in Africa, and they will continue to be involved and will work hard with us to provide solutions, especially as we come up with plans for security. There's a role for the United Nations and UNAMID and UNMISS, and there's a role for AFRICOM.
So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, thank you also for your questions there. We have to take a short break here, and then we get a perspective from the United Nations, the head of the UN mission there, when we come back with our discussion. Don't go away. Welcome back. A tenuous 5-year-old peace deal with Sudan is holding, but only just. International aid groups say that agreement is on the brink of collapse, with rising violence, poverty and bad politics threatening to plunge southern Sudan back into an all-out war if the world doesn't respond immediately. Joining us now from New York is Michael Gowett, who manages the United Nations mission in Sudan from the UN headquarters. He helped broker the peace agreement that ended Africa's longest-running civil war. Michael Gowett, thank you very much for being with us. And I wonder, with this talk of Africa solving Africa's problems, can, in this case, Sudan have any hope of finding long-term and secure, complete secure peace without any kind of intervention from the international community?
Well, Riz, I'm glad you opened with that question. That brings me to your initial question, the first one that you posed to the General, about whether the international community was in fact sufficiently invested in Sudan. And the answer to that question is an unequivocal yes. The United Nations has deployed 2 peacekeeping operations to Sudan, one in the south and one to Darfur. They cost about $2.5 billion. The largest aid operation in the world is in Darfur. President Obama has an envoy to Sudan, likewise President Sarkozy, Prime Minister Brown, President Mubarak, and others. The international engagement is enormous and serious, and yet we see that the problems aren't solved. So in a way, your question answers itself. The international community is involved, but it'll be the Sudanese who fix this problem.
Well, sir, you know, the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, as we've been saying, has been indicted by the International Criminal Court on charges that include crimes against humanity. And I wonder, that move has been opposed by large elements within the international community. How does that complicate the effort to try to find lasting peace?
I think there are 2 important points to make. The first is that the role of President Bashir going forward in domestic politics will be made by the Sudanese people through due process. And the other point that often gets lost in the hyperbole and the extremist positions is that there is now an exercise in due process that must take place. The ICC has leveled charges against President Bashir. The Security Council, that is to say the powerful nations that run the UN, they have some options and some obligations to make. The Sudanese also have choices to make. They can take national action, they can defer it internationally. The point is there's a process, and if rule of law is going to be the governing factor, then that process has to run its course. extremists on both sides of this discussion, the ones who say Bashir should present himself to The Hague to exaggerate, and those who say it should be completely dropped in the name of security and progress, they miss the point. The point is that the process has been initiated and it has to run its course, and ultimately the Sudanese people will make the decision.
How do you regard the prospect of sanctions against Khartoum, in particular in trying to make sure that those sanctions don't hurt population, the civilian population that's already fairly beleaguered?
I think we've had mixed experience with sanctions. I think clearly they're on the table. I think the more important point and more easily made point is that there have to be incentives for doing things right and disincentives for doing things wrong. And right now it's clear that both sides of this discussion, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and the National Congress Party in the North, they have a lot of hard work to do, and we need to see them making progress. And if they don't, then the bodies that are in charge of overseeing these things should talk seriously to both parties.
Now let me ask you about the indictment of the president leading to an increase in the number of attacks on humanitarian aid groups. I wonder how that's complicating the effort to try to provide some kind of relief for the people there.
I'm not sure that the connection is that direct. There was a direct connection made between the issuing of the indictment and the expulsion by the Sudanese authorities of 13 very important non-governmental humanitarian organizations, and that was a real blow to the aid effort, and one that was certainly, in fact, dangerous for his own people. The situation seems to have recovered, and the aid effort seems to be back on track, but it's being held by an increasingly tenuous thread, and not least because there's some fatigue internationally with this operation, which has now been going on for 5 years. But you know, Riz, I'd like to bring the focus back to the actions that have to be taken by the parties. The General Graan, President Obama's envoy, was right to be constructive, but we also have to be realistic. There are some very, very important steps that need to be taken. The border between North and South hasn't been agreed. The census hasn't been agreed. Legislation governing national security hasn't been agreed. And until these really significant knots are untied, we're not going to be able to move forward.
We had a couple of emails, a couple of messages from viewers on the issue of the North and South splitting. Let me put the first one to you. It's from Elibaba Kilebo, who posted this question on our Facebook page, writing, "Why is South Sudan's referendum for cessation taking so long? And what is the African Union's role?" And the second viewer question is from Georgia in the United States, and this is from Muaz Atal-Sid in the USA, as I said. "Sudan's problem is that there are many political groups, many ethnic groups, and they're all struggling and fighting to acquire resources and control more territorial ground for farming, grazing, etc. Particularly the problem of South Sudan will not end with a referendum." So, first of all, why the delay in the referendum on that secession, and could the South look after itself if it does end up as a separate entity?
In fact, Riz, the first question should be modulated maybe a little bit. The referendum is scheduled based on the agreement that your program is commemorating, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. It's scheduled to take place in January 2011, so it's not yet late. What is late, and startlingly so, are the preparations required to credibly take the referendum forward. And I'm not just talking about registering where the voters are and making organizations for the actual act for the day of the referendum. What all Sudanese officials are well behind on is preparations for the day after. And so that's where our focus is. How will South Sudan govern itself if, in fact, its people vote to secede? How will all of Sudan ensure that South Sudan becomes an equal partner in that whole Sudan if the people of the South vote to stay with Sudan? So our concern isn't with the start date of the referendum, it's with being ready for what comes after. Now, on the AU's role, I think we can say that they've taken a very high profile and high level commitment and made it real by appointing former President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa to look into the full spectrum of challenges that the Sudanese are facing. So the African Union is very much leaning forward. There is clearly a preference within the AU for countries to remain unified, but the position of the African Union is that they will respect the outcome of the referendum. Now, Riz, if you could remind me on the second question.
Well, yeah, the second part was really, could the South look after itself? And I think you've sort of covered elements of what happens afterwards. But do you think the South is self-sustaining?
At the moment, the short answer is no. The longer answer is that in the 5 years since the CPA was signed, they have made decades worth of strides. There's a structure in place. There are systems in place. Officials have been appointed. Budget is slowly beginning to find its way down to the grassroots, but all of it is insufficient for the South to be ready to stand up on its own in January. And in fact, the accountability for that has to be, I think, equally or equitably dispersed. There are the officials in the South who bear the enormous responsibility of preparing their region for potential secession or unity with the North, but there's also the West and the donors who made fantastical promises about aid that would make its way into southern Sudan to form what's commonly known as a peace dividend, so that each Sudanese men, women, and children would feel the difference from war to peace. The peace dividend hasn't come through, and that in fact has been one of the failings, I would say, of our international effort.
Let's squeeze in a call from Nigeria. Tariq is on the line. Tariq, go ahead, please.
Please. I would like to ask about the recent clashes in southern Sudan. All the news media, they're trying to say the peace process is broken and they might be going back to war, but nobody has acknowledged the fact that the recent clashes are actually among southern tribes themselves. And the central government in Khartoum is actually that acts as a buffer when it comes to such clashes. So
Okay.
can you comment on that, please?
Yes, go ahead. Michael, go ahead. Do you have
Certainly, Tariq. I'm not sure I would say that they're completely disassociated. I'm not sure I would agree with you on whether or not the authorities in the north act as a buffer, as you described it. What's very clear is that part of the reason for this terrible violence, and 2,500 people died last year, as you said in your introduction, Riz, part of the reason is that the South is dealing with having spent 22 years at war and now being at peace, and also dealing with the enormous uncertainty of what comes next. And indeed, as in any potentially democratic state, there isn't perfect unity of opinion, and there are groups that are competing for resources. But what's important to stress is that the more that the South can strengthen its systems and its governance abilities, the less chance that that kind of violence will continue. And for them to strengthen their governance abilities, they need help from the North. It'll be a unified effort to make things better.
Well, Michael Goet, I thank you very much for joining us there for that perspective on Sudan. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Riz. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us with your questions. Now, remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the topics we cover and post your questions and comments. On the next show, Pakistan in crisis as the army battles the Taliban and bomb attacks kill civilians across the country. We ask if Pakistan is being pushed to the brink. Do make sure you tune in for that and send in your questions too from me and the team. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.